I stared at the box of returned gifts sitting on my kitchen table, each one carefully wrapped just days ago with hope and love. The note attached was brief but devastating. "We don't want your cheap stuff anymore. Please stop embarrassing us with these donations." The handwriting was unmistakably Rachel's, my daughter-in-law, written in her perfect cursive that somehow managed to look cold even on paper. My hands trembled as I read it for the third time, the words cutting deeper each time. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. For 23 years, I had been trying to build a relationship with the woman who married my son David. 23 years of swallowing my pride, biting my tongue, and pretending not to notice the way she looked at everything I gave them like it was contaminated. But this morning, when I found that box on my doorstep, with all the Christmas gifts I'd spent weeks carefully selecting, something inside me finally cracked. The irony wasn't lost on me. Rachel, who spent money like water and changed her designer handbags more often than most people changed their sheets, was calling my gifts cheap. These weren't random items I'd grabbed from a clearance bin. I had saved for months to buy Tyler that vintage baseball card he'd mentioned wanting, and Emma's art supplies were from the same store where professional artists shopped. But none of that mattered to Rachel. Nothing I did ever mattered to her. My name is Andrea Thompson, and at 74 years old, I never imagined I'd be sitting in my small apartment at Maple Gardens, staring at a box of rejected Christmas gifts, and wondering where everything went so wrong. The apartment is cozy enough, 2 bedrooms with cream-colored walls and furniture that's seen better days but still serves its purpose. After Henry died 5 years ago, I sold our family home and moved here, thinking it would be easier to maintain and closer to David's family. What a naive fool I was. The morning light streamed through my kitchen window, illuminating the dust particles that danced in the air like tiny reminders of all the dreams that had crumbled over the years. I made myself a cup of coffee, the same routine I'd followed for decades, but today even that simple pleasure felt hollow. The silence in my apartment was deafening, broken only by the occasional sound of my neighbors going about their morning routines. I thought about calling David, my only child, but what would I say? That his wife had hurt my feelings again? That I was tired of being treated like a charity case by my own family? David had made his choice long ago, and it wasn't me. He'd chosen peace over principle, comfort over conflict, and most importantly, he'd chosen Rachel over everyone else, including his own mother. The worst part wasn't even the rejection of the gifts. It was the timing. Christmas had always been our special time, the one occasion when the family came together and pretended we were functional. I spent weeks planning what to get everyone, carefully considering their interests, their needs, their personalities. For Tyler's 18th birthday last month, I'd noticed him looking at vintage baseball cards online when I visited. I saved up my Social Security money for 2 months to buy him a 1987 rookie card of his favorite player. For Emma, who was 15 and constantly drawing in her sketchbook, I bought professional-grade colored pencils and a leather-bound journal. Rachel's gift had been the most challenging. What do you buy for a woman who already has everything and finds fault with anything that doesn't come from an expensive department store? I settled on a beautiful silk scarf from a boutique downtown, something I thought was elegant and tasteful. The price tag had made me wince, but I told myself it was worth it if it brought us closer. Apparently, I was wrong about that too. I picked up one of the gift boxes and shook it gently, hearing the rattle of the colored pencils inside. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Emma probably never even saw these. Rachel likely intercepted them before they could reach their intended recipients, just like she'd done with so many of my attempts to connect with my grandchildren over the years. How many birthday cards had never made it to Tyler? How many little notes I'd written to Emma had been thrown away before she could read them? The phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. The caller ID showed Helen Morrison's name, and I felt a wave of relief. Helen was one of my closest friends here at Maple Gardens, a woman in her 70s who'd moved here around the same time I did. We'd bonded over our shared experiences of feeling invisible to our adult children and their families. "Good morning, Andrea," Helen's cheerful voice came through the receiver. "Are you ready for our coffee date at Rosewood Diner? Margaret and Susan are already here, and we've got the corner booth." I glanced at the clock on my microwave. 9:30. I'd completely lost track of time staring at those returned gifts. "I'll be there in 15 minutes, I replied, grateful for the distraction. "Everything all right, dear? You sound upset." I looked at the box again, at Rachel's note still lying beside it like evidence of a crime. "I'll tell you when I get there." The walk to Rosewood Diner took me through the heart of Millfield, past the shops and cafes that had been here since I was young. This town had been my home for over 40 years, the place where I'd raised David, where Henry and I had built our life together. Every street corner held memories, most of them good ones from better times when family meant something different than it did now. Rosewood Diner was one of those classic American establishments that seemed frozen in time, with red vinyl booths, black and white checkered floors, and waitresses who called everyone honey and actually meant it. Helen, Margaret, and Susan were already seated in our usual corner booth, three women who'd become the family I'd never expected to need. Helen Morrison was 73, a retired schoolteacher whose sharp wit and protective instincts reminded me of a mother hen watching over her chicks. Her silver hair was always perfectly styled, and she had a way of seeing through people's pretenses that was both comforting and intimidating. Margaret Patterson, at 76, was the practical one among us, a former nurse who approached every problem with methodical precision and an arsenal of common-sense solutions. Susan Davis, the youngest at 68, was our resident optimist, always finding silver linings even in the darkest clouds. These three women had saved my sanity more times than I could count. They understood what it was like to love children who'd grown up to become strangers, to want relationships with grandchildren who barely acknowledged your existence, to feel like outsiders in families you'd created. "There she is," Margaret said warmly as I approached the booth. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Andrea. What's wrong?" I slid into the booth next to Susan, placing the note from Rachel on the table. This was attached to a box of returned Christmas gifts I found on my doorstep this morning. The three women leaned forward to read the note, their expressions changing from curiosity to shock to outrage in a matter of seconds. Helen was the first to speak, her voice tight with controlled anger. "That little witch actually wrote this down? She put her cruelty in writing?" "Language, Helen," Margaret chided gently, though her own face showed clear disapproval. "But honestly, Andrea, this is beyond the pale. Who returns Christmas gifts like this?" Susan shook her head, her usual optimism notably absent. "What kind of person calls gifts from a grandmother cheap stuff? Even if she didn't like them, which is her loss, there are ways to handle these things with grace. I ordered my usual coffee and blueberry muffin, though I doubted I'd be able to eat much. My stomach was churning with a mixture of hurt, anger, and something else I couldn't quite identify. Maybe it was relief. Maybe after years of pretending everything was fine, I was finally ready to admit that my relationship with my son's family was broken beyond repair. "Tell us everything," Helen said, settling back in the booth with her arms crossed. "Start from the beginning. What exactly did you give them?" I described each gift in detail, explaining my thought process, the time I'd spent shopping, the money I'd saved. With each item I mentioned, my friends' faces grew more incredulous. These weren't thoughtless gifts or obvious regifts. They were carefully chosen, personal presents that showed I'd been paying attention to my grandchildren's interests and personalities. "Wait a minute," Margaret interrupted when I got to the part about Tyler's baseball card. "You said this was a 1987 rookie card? Do you remember which player?" "Greg Maddux," I replied. Tyler had been looking at them online, comparing prices. I thought he'd appreciate having one for his collection. Margaret's eyebrows shot up. "Andrea, do you have any idea what one of those cards is worth? Especially if it's in good condition." I shrugged. "It cost me $200, which was a lot for me, but I wanted to give him something special." $200? Susan gasped. "And she called it cheap?" Helen was already pulling out her phone, typing something rapidly. After a few moments, she looked up with an expression I'd never seen before. "Andrea, a mint condition 1987 Greg Maddux rookie card can sell for anywhere from $800 to $1,500, depending on its grade. You didn't buy him cheap stuff, you bought him an investment. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. I'd known the card was valuable, but not that valuable. The shop owner had given me what he called a grandmother discount, but I'd assumed he was just being kind. Now I realized he'd probably sold me something worth much more than what I'd paid. "And the art supplies?" Margaret prompted. "Professional-grade colored pencils and a leather journal from Morrison Art Supply downtown," I replied, naming the store where local artists and college students bought their materials. Susan whistled low. "That's not a hobby shop, Andrea. That's where serious artists go. Those supplies probably cost you a fortune." $300, I admitted quietly. "But Emma is so talented, and she's always drawing. I thought she deserved quality materials." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. $500 worth of gifts, carefully chosen and thoughtfully purchased, dismissed as cheap stuff, by a woman who wouldn't know genuine sentiment if it hit her in the face. "What about Rachel's gift?" Helen asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer would be infuriating. "A silk scarf from Valentina's boutique," I said. The saleswoman assured me it was their most popular item, perfect for any occasion. Margaret nearly choked on her coffee. "Valentina's? Andrea? That place is where the mayor's wife shops. Nothing in there costs less than $200. The full scope of Rachel's insult was becoming clear. Nearly $800 worth of carefully chosen gifts, and she'd called them cheap. Not just cheap, but embarrassing. Donations. As if I were some charity case trying to foist my unwanted possessions on her perfect family. "There's something else," I said quietly, and my friends leaned in closer. "This isn't the first time. Over the years, I've given them dozens of gifts for birthdays, holidays, graduations. I never see any of them in their house when I visit. I always wondered what happened to them." "You think she's been throwing them away?" Susan asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Or returning them for store credit," Helen said grimly. "Making money off your generosity while making you feel worthless." The thought had occurred to me before, but I'd always pushed it away, telling myself I was being paranoid. Now, with this note in front of me, paranoia was starting to look like reality. "How long has this been going on?" Margaret asked. I thought back, trying to remember when things had started to change between Rachel and me. It got worse after Henry died. Before that, she at least pretended to be grateful. But once he was gone, she stopped making an effort. I think she figured I didn't have any allies left. Henry had always been better at dealing with Rachel than I was. He had a way of charming people, of making them feel special, even when they were being difficult. Rachel had actually seemed to like him, or at least respect him. After his funeral, she'd made it clear that any tolerance she'd shown had been for his benefit, not mine. "What does David say about all this?" Helen asked, though her tone suggested she suspected the answer. "David doesn't see it," I said, the familiar pain of that reality settling in my chest. "Or he chooses not to see it. Rachel is very careful about when and how she shows her true colors. Around him, she's the perfect wife and mother. It's only when we're alone that the mask comes off." "But surely he's noticed that you don't have a relationship with your grandchildren," Susan pressed. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "He thinks it's normal. Kids today are busy," he says. "They have their own lives, their own interests. He doesn't seem to find it odd that Tyler and Emma barely acknowledge my existence when I'm around." The truth was more complicated than that. David did notice, but he'd chosen to interpret the situation in a way that didn't require him to confront his wife. It was easier to believe that I was being too sensitive, too needy, too old-fashioned in my expectations of family relationships. It was easier than admitting that the woman he'd married was systematically isolating his children from their grandmother. "When was the last time you had a real conversation with Tyler or Emma?" Margaret asked gently. I had to think about it, which was answer enough. "Tyler's graduation party last spring, maybe? He thanked me for coming. We talked about his college plans for a few minutes." But Rachel kept finding reasons to interrupt. pulling him away to meet other guests or take pictures. And Emma? She's more. I struggled to find the right words. She's not openly rude like her mother, but she's distant. Polite but distant. Like I'm an acquaintance she has to be nice to, rather than her grandmother. The worst part was that I could see flashes of the children they used to be. Tyler had been such a curious little boy, always asking questions about everything. He'd loved when I'd tell him stories about his father's childhood, about the trouble David used to get into and the adventures they'd had. Emma had been my little artist from the time she could hold a crayon, always wanting to show me her latest creation and asking me to draw with her. When had they stopped seeing me as someone worth their time? When had I become just another obligation, another adult they had to tolerate at family gatherings? You know what I think? Helen said, stirring her coffee with more force than necessary. I think Rachel has been poisoning them against you for years. Little comments here and there, subtle undermining, making them think you're out of touch, irrelevant, embarrassing. But why? I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. What have I ever done to her? You exist, Margaret said bluntly. You represent David's life before her. You have a claim on his affection that she can't control. Some women can't stand sharing their husbands with anyone, even their own mothers. Susan nodded sadly. I've seen it before. The daughter-in-law who gradually isolates her husband from his family, making him choose between keeping peace at home and maintaining other relationships. It's emotional manipulation, and it works because most men will do anything to avoid conflict in their marriages. I thought about David's behavior over the past few years, how he'd gradually become less available, less present in my life. Phone calls that used to be weekly became monthly, then holiday only. Visits that used to be regular became rare, and when they did happen, they were rushed, perfunctory, like items being checked off a to-do list. I keep thinking I should have fought harder, I admitted. When I first noticed Rachel's attitude toward me changing, I should have said something to David. I should have demanded better treatment. Hindsight is 20/20, Helen said kindly, and you were trying to keep the peace. You didn't want to make David choose between you and his wife. But he chose anyway, I pointed out. By doing nothing, he chose her. The conversation was interrupted by our waitress, a woman named Betty who'd been working at Rosewood Diner for as long as I could remember. She refilled our coffee cups and asked if we needed anything else, her motherly concern evident as she noticed our serious expressions. Everything all right, ladies? You all look like you're planning a revolution. Maybe we are, Helen muttered, and Betty chuckled as she moved on to the next table. After she left, Susan leaned forward with a determined expression. Andrea, I need to ask you something, and I want you to really think about your answer. When was the last time being around David's family made you genuinely happy? The question caught me off guard, not because it was difficult to answer, but because the answer was so clear and so devastating. I couldn't remember the last time I'd left their house feeling good about myself, feeling loved, feeling like I mattered to them. Every interaction had become an exercise in walking on eggshells, trying not to say or do anything that would give Rachel ammunition against me. I can't remember, I said quietly. Then what are you fighting for? Margaret asked gently. If these relationships only bring you pain, if your presence in their lives is clearly unwanted, what exactly are you trying to preserve? It was a fair question, one I'd been avoiding asking myself for years. What was I fighting for? The fantasy of being a beloved grandmother? The hope that someday Rachel would accept me? The dream that my grandchildren would want to know me as a person, not just tolerate me as an obligation? I guess I keep thinking it will get better, I said. That someday Rachel will realize I'm not a threat to her marriage, that the kids will want to have an adult relationship with me when they're older. And if it doesn't get better, Helen asked, if this is as good as it gets, can you live with that? Before I could answer, my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from David, and my heart jumped with the ridiculous hope that maybe he'd found out about the returned gifts and was calling to apologize. The message was brief. Mom, Rachel mentioned you might have been confused about the Christmas gifts. No big deal, but maybe next time just ask what they need instead of guessing. Talk soon. I showed the message to my friends, watching their faces cycle through disbelief, anger, and something approaching rage. Helen was the first to speak, her voice dangerously quiet. Confused? She's making you sound like you have dementia. And asking what they need? Margaret shook her head. Like you're a service provider rather than a grandmother who wants to show love through thoughtful gifts. Susan took my phone and read the message again. Andrea, this isn't just dismissive. This is gaslighting. She's making him think you're the problem, that you're losing your mental faculties and can't be trusted to make appropriate decisions. The manipulation was so clear now that it was pointed out to me. Rachel hadn't just returned the gifts. She'd spun a narrative that made me the confused old woman who couldn't be expected to understand what was appropriate. And David had bought it completely, as evidenced by his patronizing response. "What are you going to do?" Helen asked. I stared at the message on my phone screen, reading it over and over. Each time, the casual dismissal hurt a little more. My son, the baby I'd carried for 9 months, the child I'd raised with love and sacrifice, was now treating me like a burden who needed to be managed, rather than a mother who deserved respect. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but I do know I can't keep doing this. I can't keep pretending that these crumbs of attention are enough, that being tolerated is the same as being loved." Margaret reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Whatever you decide to do, we're here for you. You don't have to face this alone." I looked around the table at these 3 women who'd become more family to me than my actual family, and I felt something shift inside me. Maybe it was time to stop fighting for people who didn't want me and start appreciating the ones who did. "You know what the worst part is?" I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. "I've been so focused on trying to earn their love that I forgot I already have love. Right here, with all of you. I've been starving myself emotionally while sitting at a feast." "Now you're talking sense," Helen said with approval. As we finished our coffee and prepared to leave the diner, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Clarity. For the first time since that box appeared on my doorstep, I wasn't focused on the pain of rejection. Instead, I was thinking about possibilities, about what my life could look like if I stopped pouring energy into relationships that would never give me anything back. The returned gifts were still waiting for me when I got home, but they didn't seem as devastating anymore. They were evidence, proof of something I'd suspected but been too afraid to acknowledge. My son's family didn't want me in their lives, and continuing to force my presence would only lead to more hurt for everyone involved. But as I sat in my quiet apartment, looking at those carefully chosen gifts that had been so casually rejected, I realized something else. This wasn't just about them anymore. This was about me, about what I was willing to accept, about what I deserved. And I deserved so much more than this. The next morning brought a cold snap that seemed to mirror my mood. I woke up feeling restless, unable to shake the conversation from yesterday at Rosewood Diner. My friend's words kept echoing in my mind, particularly Margaret's question about what I was fighting for. I'd barely slept, tossing and turning as memories of the past few years played like a cruel movie in my head. I was making my morning tea when the phone rang. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number, but something compelled me to answer. "Mrs. Thompson? This is Janet Wilson from Morrison Art Supply. I hope I'm not calling too early." Morrison Art Supply. The store where I'd bought Emma's professional art materials, the ones Rachel had dismissed as cheap. "Not at all, Janet. How can I help you?" "Well, this is a bit unusual, but yesterday a young woman came in trying to return some items. Colored pencils, and a leather journal. She said they were the wrong brand, but when I checked our records I saw you'd purchased them just last week. She had no receipt, and frankly, the items looked like they'd never been opened." My stomach dropped. Rachel had not only returned my gifts to David's family, she'd actually taken them to the store to try to get money for them. "What did you tell her?" "I told her I couldn't process a return without a receipt or the original purchaser present." She became quite agitated, insisting that her daughter didn't want them, and that they were taking up space. She seemed particularly upset when I mentioned that the pencils alone were worth over $200. $200 for just the pencils. I'd spent more than I'd realized, and Rachel had tried to turn my granddaughter's Christmas gift into cash. "Thank you for calling me, Janet. I appreciate your honesty. Mrs. Thompson, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but in 30 years of running this shop, I've never seen such beautiful, thoughtful gifts. Whoever they were intended for is very lucky to have someone who cares enough to choose such quality materials." After hanging up, I sat at my kitchen table feeling nauseated. It was one thing to reject gifts. It was another entirely to try to profit from them. Rachel hadn't just dismissed my thoughtfulness. She had attempted to turn it into her own financial gain. How many other gifts over the years had she quietly returned for store credit or cash? The phone rang again, almost immediately. This time it was Helen, her voice tight with excitement. "Andrea, you need to meet us at the diner right now. Margaret found something you need to see." "What kind of something?" "Just trust me. This is important." 20 minutes later, I was back in our corner booth at Rosewood, facing three very serious-looking women. Margaret had her tablet out, and Susan was practically vibrating with nervous energy. Helen gestured for me to sit down before speaking. "After yesterday, Margaret decided to do some investigating. Tell her what you found." Margaret adjusted her reading glasses and turned the tablet toward me. "I've been thinking about what you said regarding Rachel's charity work. You mentioned she's always posting on social media about fundraising events and volunteer work, right?" I nodded. Rachel's Facebook page was a carefully curated showcase of her supposed generosity. Photos of her at charity galas, posts about donation drives she was organizing, shares of various causes she claimed to support. David was always bragging about how charitable his wife was, how she was making a difference in the community. Well, I decided to look into some of these organizations she claims to work with. This is what I found. Margaret pulled up a series of screenshots on her tablet. 3 of the charities she's posted about supporting in the past year don't exist. I searched the state registry of nonprofit organizations, called the Better Business Bureau, even Googled them extensively. Nothing. My mouth went dry. "What do you mean they don't exist?" "I mean, she's posting about supporting organizations that are completely fictional. Look at this post from October." She showed me a Facebook post where Rachel was posing with a large check made out to something called Millfield Children's Future Fund. The post had dozens of likes and comments praising her generosity. I called the address listed on the check. It's a vacant lot downtown that's been empty for 5 years. The phone number goes to a disconnected line. Susan leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "That's not all. Show her about the fundraising." Margaret swiped to another screenshot. This one really made my blood boil. Last month, Rachel organized what she called a holiday hope drive on Facebook. She asked people to donate money so she could buy Christmas gifts for underprivileged children in Millfield. According to her posts, she raised over $3,000. "But here's the thing," Helen interjected, her voice sharp with anger. "I volunteer at the Millfield Community Center, where she claimed she was distributing these gifts. I asked around, checked with the social workers, talked to the director. No one there has ever heard of Rachel Morrison or any holiday hope drive." Morrison. I'd never really thought about Rachel keeping her maiden name for some activities, but hearing it now made my skin crawl. She was using a different name for her fake charity work, probably to avoid any connection to David if she got caught. "So where did the money go?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Margaret pulled up another photo, this one from Rachel's Instagram account. It showed her wearing an expensive-looking coat, tagged at a high-end boutique in the city. The timestamp showed it was posted just days after her holiday hope drive had supposedly ended. "This coat costs $2,800, Margaret said grimly. I called the boutique to confirm. She paid cash for it on December 15th, right around the time she would have collected all those donations. The room spun around me. I gripped the edge of the table, trying to process what I was hearing. Rachel wasn't just dismissive and cruel. She was a fraud. She was stealing money from people who thought they were helping children in need, money she was using to fund her expensive lifestyle. "There's more," Susan said quietly. "Tell her about the baseball card situation." Margaret flipped to a new screen on her tablet. "Remember how shocked we were yesterday when we learned how valuable Tyler's baseball card actually was? Well, I decided to do some research on that too. I found several online forums where collectors buy and sell vintage cards. She showed me a listing that made my heart stop. It was Tyler's Greg Maddux rookie card, the exact one I'd purchased for him. The listing was posted by someone with the username rmorrison81 and had been posted 2 days after Christmas. "She sold it," I whispered, staring at the screen. She sold Tyler's Christmas gift. For $1,200, Margaret confirmed. The listing says it was in mint condition, never removed from its protective case, just like how you would have given it to Tyler. I felt like I might be sick. Not only had Rachel rejected my carefully chosen gift, she'd stolen it from her own son and sold it for profit. Tyler had never even seen the card I'd saved months to buy for him. He had no idea that his grandmother had given him something valuable, something that showed how much attention I paid to his interests. But wait, I said, a horrible thought occurring to me. If she sold it online, wouldn't David see the money? Wouldn't he ask where it came from? Helen and Margaret exchanged a look that told me they'd already considered this. Andrea, Helen said gently, how much do you really know about David and Rachel's financial situation? The question caught me off guard. What do you mean? They seem comfortable. The house in Oakwood Heights, Rachel's shopping habits, the kids' private school tuition. That's what they want people to think, Susan said. But Margaret made some other discoveries yesterday. Margaret pulled up what looked like a real estate website. Their house went into foreclosure proceedings 3 months ago. The bank filed the initial paperwork in September, and they're currently behind on 6 months of mortgage payments. My world tilted. David and Rachel were facing foreclosure? How was that possible? David had a good job as an engineer at Morrison Manufacturing, the biggest employer in Millfield. Rachel worked part-time at a marketing firm. Together, they should have been making enough to comfortably afford their lifestyle. How did you find this out? I asked. Foreclosure proceedings are public record, Margaret explained. Once I started digging, I found a lot of concerning information. They've maxed out at least 4 credit cards, they have 3 different personal loans, and Rachel's car was repossessed last month, though they've managed to keep that quiet. Repossessed? I thought about the last time I'd seen Rachel, just 2 weeks ago, when I'd stopped by with the Christmas gifts. She'd been driving her usual silver sedan, the one she'd had for 3 years. They'd been renting a similar car to maintain appearances, Susan explained. My nephew works at the rental agency. He told me they've been paying weekly rates, which is incredibly expensive, but it lets them keep up the pretense that everything is fine. The picture that was emerging was devastating. David and Rachel weren't just struggling financially, they were drowning. The perfect life they projected on social media, the generous charitable work, the expensive clothes and lifestyle, it was all a facade built on debt and deception. So when Rachel calls my gifts cheap, I said slowly, she's really angry that they're not valuable enough to help with their financial problems. Exactly, Helen said. She's not rejecting your gifts because they're inadequate. She's rejecting them because they can't be easily converted to cash to pay their bills. I thought about all the gifts I'd given over the years, all the items that had mysteriously disappeared from their house between visits. Had Rachel been systematically selling everything I gave them? Had any of my presents ever actually reached Tyler and Emma? Or had they all been turned into money to fund their unsustainable lifestyle? This explains why she was so upset about the art supplies, too, Margaret continued. High-quality art materials hold their value, but they're harder to sell quickly than something like a baseball card. She probably couldn't find a buyer immediately, so she tried to return them to the store for cash. The waitress came by to refill our coffee cups, and I was grateful for the brief interruption. My mind was reeling from everything I'd learned. The son I'd raised to be honest and responsible was living a lie, married to a woman who was actively committing fraud while presenting herself as a pillar of the community. Does David know? I asked when we were alone again. About the fake charities, the stolen donations. That's the million-dollar question, Helen said. Either he knows and he's complicit, or Rachel has been hiding all of this from him too. I wanted to believe that David was innocent, that he was being deceived just like everyone else. But a part of me wondered how someone could live with a person and not notice that kind of systematic dishonesty. How do you not question where thousands of dollars in donations disappear to? How do you not wonder why your mother's gifts keep vanishing? There's something else, Susan said hesitantly. Margaret, show her what you found about the kids. Margaret looked uncomfortable as she pulled up another screen. I wasn't sure if I should mention this, but you deserve to know everything. It's about Tyler's college situation. What about it? I asked, though I was already dreading the answer. He's not enrolled anywhere, Margaret said quietly. I checked with the registrar's office at every college within 100 miles. Tyler Morrison, Tyler Thompson, Tyler Morrison Thompson, nothing. No one by that name is enrolled as a student anywhere that I could find. My heart sank. David had been so proud when he told me Tyler had been accepted to State University, had gotten into their engineering program just like his father. We talked about Tyler following in David's footsteps, about how bright his future looked. But David told me Tyler was doing well in his first semester, I protested weakly. When was the last time you actually spoke to Tyler directly about school? Helen asked gently. I thought about it, and realized that all my information about Tyler's college experience had come through David and Rachel. When I asked Tyler about school during my brief visits, he usually gave vague answers before excusing himself or being called away by his mother. So where is he? I asked. Margaret pulled up another screen, this one showing what looked like a social media profile. Based on his online activity, he's been working at a fast food restaurant downtown. Not that there's anything wrong with that, she added quickly, but it's not college. The profile showed Tyler in a uniform, joking with coworkers, complaining about difficult customers. It painted a picture of a young man working a minimum wage job, not a college student studying engineering. Why would they lie about this? I asked, though I was beginning to understand. The perfect family image that Rachel cultivated required successful children. A son working at a fast food restaurant instead of attending college didn't fit the narrative she'd built on social media. Because the truth doesn't match the image they're selling, Susan said sadly. Rachel's whole identity is built around being the perfect wife and mother with the perfect family. Admitting that Tyler isn't in college would crack that facade. I stared at the evidence my friends had gathered, feeling overwhelmed by the scope of the deception. My daughter-in-law wasn't just dismissive and cruel, she was a systematic liar who was defrauding charitable donors and manipulating everyone around her, including her own family. What about Emma? I asked, almost afraid to hear the answer. As far as we can tell, she's actually doing well in school, Margaret said, offering the first piece of good news. But Andrea, there's something else you should know about her situation. She pulled up what looked like a school website. Emma is incredibly talented, just like you always said. She won a statewide art competition last month, and her work is being displayed in the state capitol building. I felt a surge of pride for my granddaughter, followed immediately by hurt. Why didn't anyone tell me? That's wonderful news. Because according to the article about the competition, Emma Morrison listed her inspiration as, quote, overcoming family negativity to pursue her artistic dreams. When they interviewed her, she mentioned having to hide her art supplies from family members who didn't support her creative pursuits. The words hit me like a physical blow. Emma had to hide her art supplies. The professional-grade materials I'd bought for her, the ones Rachel had dismissed as cheap, were exactly what Emma needed. But instead of receiving them with joy and gratitude, she'd never even seen them. Rachel had intercepted my gift and tried to sell it, leaving Emma to struggle with inadequate supplies while believing her family didn't support her dreams. She doesn't know, I whispered. Emma doesn't know that I've been trying to support her art. She thinks her family, including me, doesn't care about her talent. Rachel has been controlling the narrative, Helen said angrily. She's been painting you as the out-of-touch grandmother who doesn't understand or appreciate her grandchildren, while simultaneously stealing the very gifts that would prove otherwise. I felt tears forming in my eyes as the full scope of Rachel's manipulation became clear. She hadn't just been rejecting my gifts, she'd been actively sabotaging my relationship with my grandchildren. Every thoughtful present, every attempt to connect with Tyler and Emma's interests, had been twisted into evidence that I didn't care or didn't understand them. There's one more thing, Margaret said hesitantly. I found this in the local police blotter from last week. She showed me an entry that made my blood run cold. David Thompson, age 47, had been arrested for driving under the influence. The incident had occurred on a Tuesday evening, and he'd been released on bail the following morning. David's been drinking and driving? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. It looks like it was his first offense, Susan said quickly. But Andrea, this was the same week you dropped off the Christmas gifts. The same week Rachel returned them with that horrible note. The timeline was becoming clearer. David had been arrested for DUI, probably adding legal fees and increased insurance costs to their already overwhelming financial troubles. Rachel, desperate for money and furious about their situation, had seen my thoughtful gifts as just another reminder of their failures. Instead of appreciating the love behind them, she'd seen only items that couldn't immediately solve their financial crisis. So when I showed up with Christmas gifts, I said slowly, Rachel was dealing with her husband's arrest, their mortgage being in foreclosure, and mounting bills. My gifts weren't just unwanted, they were insulting reminders that other people still had money to spend on nice things. That doesn't excuse her behavior, Helen said firmly. Plenty of people face financial difficulties without resorting to fraud and cruelty. No, it doesn't excuse it, I agreed. But it explains it. Rachel's not just mean-spirited, she's desperate. And desperate people do terrible things. We sat in silence for a while, absorbing everything we'd learned. The picture that had emerged was far worse than simple family dysfunction. This was a web of lies, fraud, and manipulation that had been going on for years. Rachel had built an empire of deception, stealing from charitable donors, lying about her children's accomplishments, and systematically destroying my relationship with my grandchildren. What are you going to do with all this information? Margaret asked finally. I stared out the window of the diner, watching ordinary people go about their ordinary lives, unaware that my world had just been turned completely upside down. 24 hours ago, my biggest problem was dealing with rejected Christmas gifts. Now I was sitting on evidence that my daughter-in-law was committing fraud, and that my son was either complicit or completely oblivious to his wife's criminal behavior. I don't know, I said honestly. Part of me wants to call David right now and confront him with all of this. But another part of me knows that if I do that, Rachel will just find a way to spin it. She'll make me look like the crazy old woman who's making up stories to cause trouble. You have evidence, Susan pointed out. Screenshots, public records, witness accounts. Evidence that she'll claim is fabricated or misunderstood, I replied. Rachel is very good at making herself look like the victim. If I come at her with accusations, she'll probably convince David that I'm having some kind of mental breakdown. Helen leaned back in the booth, her expression thoughtful. So what's your alternative? You can't just pretend you don't know any of this. No, I can't, I agreed, but I need to be smart about how I handle it. If I'm going to confront them, I need to do it in a way that makes it impossible for Rachel to manipulate the situation. Margaret closed her tablet and looked at me seriously. Andrea, I need to ask you something difficult. If you expose all of this, it's going to destroy David and Rachel's marriage. It might send Rachel to jail. It will definitely ruin their reputation in this town. Are you prepared for those consequences? The question hung in the air between us. Was I prepared to potentially destroy my son's life in order to expose the truth? Was revenge worth the collateral damage it would cause? I need to think about this, I said finally. I need to decide whether I'm doing this for the right reasons or just because I'm hurt and angry. There's no shame in being hurt and angry, Helen said. What Rachel has done to you, to the people who donated to her fake charities, to your grandchildren, it's unforgivable. But I don't want to become like her, I replied. I don't want to be someone who destroys other people's lives, even if they deserve it. As we prepared to leave the diner, Susan grabbed my arm gently. Andrea, whatever you decide to do, remember that you're not responsible for the consequences of Rachel's actions. You didn't make her lie, steal, or manipulate people. If her world falls apart when the truth comes out, that's on her, not you. Walking home from the diner, I felt the weight of everything I'd learned pressing down on me. In the span of 2 days, I'd gone from being a dismissed grandmother to holding information that could unravel an entire family. The question was, what was I going to do with that power? Part of me wanted justice. I wanted Rachel to face consequences for her fraud, her theft, her systematic cruelty. I wanted David to understand how thoroughly he'd been deceived and manipulated. I wanted Tyler and Emma to know that their grandmother had been trying to love and support them all along. But another part of me wondered if exposing everything would just create more pain for everyone involved. Tyler and Emma would learn that their mother was a criminal, and their father was either a fool or an accomplice. David would have to face the collapse of everything he thought he knew about his life. Even if justice was served, would anyone actually be better off? As I reached my apartment building, I made a decision. I wasn't going to act on impulse or emotion. I was going to take time to think, to plan, to consider all the implications of whatever choice I made. Rachel had been building her house of lies for years. I could afford to take a few days to decide how to respond. But one thing was certain. I was done being the passive victim in this story. Rachel had underestimated me, dismissed me as a harmless old woman who would accept any treatment without fighting back. She was about to learn that she'd made a very serious mistake. The returned Christmas gifts were still sitting on my kitchen table when I got home, but they looked different now. They weren't symbols of rejection anymore. They were evidence. Evidence of theft, of manipulation, of a pattern of behavior that went far beyond simple rudeness. I picked up Rachel's note and read it again. "We don't want your cheap stuff anymore. Please stop embarrassing us with these donations." Looking at those words now, after everything I'd learned, I could see the desperation behind the cruelty. Rachel wasn't rejecting my gifts because they were inadequate. She was lashing out because they represented everything she couldn't provide for her own family. My cheap stuff was actually worth more than she could afford, and that fact must have eaten at her pride like acid. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, I felt something other than hurt and confusion. I felt clarity. Rachel had declared war on me years ago, systematically destroying my relationship with my son and grandchildren, while stealing from me and lying to everyone around her. I'd been fighting that war with one hand tied behind my back, trying to be the bigger person, trying to keep the peace. But peace was no longer an option. Rachel had made sure of that when she returned my gifts with that cruel note. Now the only question was whether I was going to win this war or lose it. And I had no intention of losing. 3 days later, opportunity knocked on my door in the most unexpected way. I was sitting in my living room, still wrestling with how to handle everything I'd learned about Rachel's deception, when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something prompted me to answer. "Mrs. Thompson? This is Carol Jensen from the Millfield Gazette. I'm working on a feature story about local charitable organizations, and your daughter-in-law Rachel Morrison was recommended as someone making a real difference in our community. Would you be willing to share some insights about her volunteer work?" My mouth went dry. The local newspaper wanted to do a feature story on Rachel's fake charity work. They were planning to celebrate her as a community hero, completely unaware that she'd been stealing thousands of dollars from well-meaning donors. "I'm not sure I'm the right person to ask," I said carefully. "Oh, but you are." Several people mentioned how proud you must be of Rachel's dedication to helping underprivileged children. The Holiday Hope Drive she organized last month was particularly impressive. We'd love to get a family perspective on her charitable spirit. The irony was suffocating. Here was a reporter calling to praise Rachel for the very fraud that Margaret had uncovered, and she wanted quotes from me about how wonderful my daughter-in-law was. It felt like the universe was forcing my hand. "When do you need this information?" I asked. "Well, we're hoping to run the story this weekend. Could we perhaps meet today? I could come to you, or we could meet somewhere convenient." I looked at the clock. It was just past 11 in the morning. "Could you meet me at Rosewood Diner at 1 o'clock? I'll need to gather some information for you." After hanging up, I immediately called my friends. Within 30 minutes, Helen, Margaret, and Susan were sitting in my living room, looking at me like I'd lost my mind. "You want to do what?" Helen asked, her voice rising in pitch. "I want to tell the reporter the truth," I said firmly. "All of it. The fake charities, the stolen donations, the returned gifts, everything." "Andrea," Margaret said carefully, "once you go public with this information, there's no taking it back. This will destroy Rachel's reputation permanently." "Good," I said, surprising myself with the vehemence in my voice. "Her reputation is built on lies and theft. She's been stealing money from people who thought they were helping children." How many families donated their hard-earned money to her fake holiday hope drive, thinking they were making Christmas better for kids in need? Susan leaned forward, her expression concerned. But what about David? What about your grandchildren? This is going to devastate them. David chose to be blind to what his wife was doing, I replied. And Tyler and Emma deserve to know the truth about why their grandmother's gifts kept disappearing. Why they never received the support I was trying to give them. The truth was, I'd spent the past 3 days thinking about nothing else. I'd considered every possible approach, from confronting Rachel privately to taking the evidence to the police. But talking to the reporter felt like the right choice because it would expose Rachel's fraud while protecting her victims. People who had donated to her fake charities deserved to know they'd been scammed. Have you thought about what you're going to say? Margaret asked. I'm going to tell her exactly what you found in your research. The fake charities, the stolen donations, the returned gifts that were sold for profit. I have documentation for all of it. Helen stood up and began pacing my small living room. Andrea, this is going to cause a scandal. Rachel might be arrested. David could lose his job if his company thinks he was involved. Are you absolutely certain you want to do this? I thought about Emma, hiding her art supplies and believing her family didn't support her dreams because she'd never received the professional materials I'd bought for her. I thought about Tyler, working at a fast food restaurant while everyone believed he was in college, probably ashamed of disappointing his family's expectations. I thought about all the people who'd donated money they could probably barely afford to what they thought was a legitimate charity. Yes, I said firmly. I'm certain. Margaret pulled out her tablet. Then we need to make sure you have everything organized. You'll want copies of all the evidence, not just the originals. For the next hour, we prepared a comprehensive file of Rachel's deception. Screenshots of the fake charity posts, records showing the organizations didn't exist, evidence of the holiday hope drive donations, photos of Rachel's expensive purchases made around the same time, documentation of the returned gifts and Tyler's baseball card being sold online, and public records showing their financial troubles. At 12:30, I walked into Rosewood Diner carrying a folder that contained enough evidence to destroy Rachel's carefully constructed facade. Carol Jensen was already waiting in a corner booth, a woman in her 40s with graying hair and kind eyes. She looked like someone who genuinely cared about the story she told, which made what I was about to do feel even more significant. Mrs. Thompson, thank you so much for meeting with me, she said as I sat down. I have to say, when people talk about Rachel Morrison, they light up. She seems to have made quite an impact on this community. She certainly made an impact, I agreed, my voice carefully neutral. Carol pulled out a small recording device and a notebook. Do you mind if I record our conversation? It helps me make sure I quote people accurately. Actually, I insist on it, I said. Accuracy is going to be very important for this story. She looked slightly puzzled by my response but turned on the recorder anyway. So tell me about Rachel's charitable work from your perspective as her mother-in-law. You must be very proud of her dedication to helping others. I took a deep breath, knowing that once I started talking, there would be no going back. Carol, before we begin, I need to tell you that this isn't going to be the story you're expecting to write. Her eyebrows raised. What do you mean? I mean that Rachel Morrison has been committing fraud, and I have evidence to prove it. I opened the folder and pulled out the first set of screenshots. These are posts from her Facebook page about supporting various charitable organizations. 3 of them don't exist. Carol's expression shifted from confusion to intense interest as I showed her Margaret's research. She examined each piece of evidence carefully, asking questions and taking detailed notes. When I got to the part about the holiday hope drive, she stopped writing and looked up at me. Are you telling me that she collected $3,000 from community members for a charity drive that never happened? That's exactly what I'm telling you. And I can prove where the money went. I showed her the photos of Rachel's expensive coat purchase, the timeline that matched perfectly with when she would have collected the donations. Carol studied the evidence for several minutes, her expression growing increasingly grim. Mrs. Thompson, these are very serious allegations. Why are you coming forward with this now? I pulled out Rachel's note, the one that had been attached to my returned Christmas gifts. Because she finally pushed me too far. I told Carol everything. The years of dismissive treatment, The gifts that mysteriously disappeared. The recent discovery that my carefully chosen Christmas presents had been returned with a cruel note, calling them cheap stuff. I explained how Margaret's investigation had revealed the scope of Rachel's deception, how my granddaughter was winning art competitions while believing her family didn't support her dreams, because she'd never received the professional supplies I'd bought for her. "So the baseball card," Carol said, reviewing her notes. "You're saying you spent $200 on a collectible card for your grandson, and instead of receiving it, his mother sold it online for $1,200? "That's correct. Tyler never even knew I'd given him that gift. As far as he knows, his grandmother gave him nothing for Christmas." Carol was quiet for a long time, reviewing all the evidence I'd provided. Finally, she looked up at me with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Mrs. Thompson, this is investigative journalism territory. These aren't just family disputes. These are potentially criminal activities. Are you prepared for the consequences of going public with this information?" "I've been thinking about nothing else for 3 days," I replied. "But I keep coming back to the same question. How many other people has she victimized? How many families donated money they could barely afford because they thought they were helping children? Rachel has been stealing from this community while positioning herself as a hero. That has to stop. What about your relationship with your son? This is going to affect him too." I felt a pang of sadness thinking about David, but I pushed it aside. My son made his choice when he allowed his wife to treat me with such disrespect. If he was truly ignorant of her activities, then he needs to know the truth. If he wasn't ignorant, then he's complicit. Carol closed her notebook and turned off the recorder. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm going to need some time to verify this information independently. I can't publish a story like this based solely on your account, no matter how compelling the evidence appears." "I understand completely. But can I ask you to do something for me?" "What's that?" "When you contact Rachel for her response, don't tell her the information came from me initially. I want to see how she reacts when she thinks she's just dealing with a reporter who stumbled onto inconsistencies in her story." Carol smiled grimly. "That's actually standard practice. I always give people a chance to respond to allegations before publishing. Though I have to warn you, if even half of this checks out, it's going to be front-page news." After Carol left, I sat in the diner for another hour, drinking coffee and trying to process what I'd just done. I'd essentially lit a fuse that would explode my son's family, and there was no way to take it back now. But as I replayed our conversation, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: the satisfaction of standing up for myself and for the truth. My phone buzzed with a text from Helen asking how the meeting had gone. Instead of responding, I decided to drive over to Maple Gardens and tell my friends in person. They deserved to know what I'd done, since their research had made it possible. When I arrived at Helen's apartment, I found all 3 women waiting anxiously for news. I told them about my conversation with Carol, about how seriously she'd taken the evidence, about her promise to investigate everything independently. "How long do you think it will take?" Susan asked. She said she hopes to have the story ready by this weekend, assuming she can verify the information. That gives her about 3 days to confirm that the charities don't exist, track down some of the people who donated to the Holiday Hope Drive, and get Rachel's response. "And you really think Rachel won't figure out that you're the source?" Margaret asked. "Not initially. Carol is a good reporter. She'll approach this like any other investigation. She'll probably start by trying to contact the fake charities, then move on to checking with the people who supposedly benefited from Rachel's fundraising. By the time she gets to Rachel directly, it'll look like she discovered the inconsistencies on her own." Helen poured us all tea, and we sat in her living room contemplating what I'd set in motion. Part of me felt guilty for potentially destroying so many lives, but a larger part felt relieved that the truth would finally come out. "What do you think will happen when the story is published?" Susan asked. "I think Rachel will panic," I said. "She'll probably try to blame everyone else, claim she was misunderstood, or that the evidence was fabricated. But with everything documented the way it is, that'll be hard to pull off." "What about David?" Margaret asked gently. I'd been dreading that question because I honestly didn't know how my son would react. David will either realize he's been living with a criminal and leave her, or he'll circle the wagons and defend her no matter what the evidence shows. Either way, I'll finally know where I stand with him. The next 2 days passed slowly. I tried to keep myself busy with normal activities, but I found myself jumping every time the phone rang, wondering if it was Carol with questions or David with accusations. My friends checked on me regularly, but there wasn't much to report. We were all just waiting for the other shoe to drop. On Friday morning, Carol called to give me an update. "Mrs. Thompson, I've been able to independently verify almost everything you told me. The charities don't exist. I found 5 people who donated to the Holiday Hope Drive and never saw any evidence that gifts were actually distributed, and I confirmed the timeline of Rachel's expensive purchases. I'm planning to contact her this afternoon for a response." "How did she react when you reached out initially?" I asked. I started by calling her about the original story idea, asking about her charitable work. She was eager to talk, very proud of what she supposedly accomplished. She had no idea I was investigating her. She thought she was going to be featured as a local hero. The irony was almost too much to bear. Rachel had been so confident in her deception that she'd enthusiastically cooperated with a reporter, never imagining that someone might actually fact-check her claims. When will the story run? Sunday's edition. Front page. Assuming she doesn't provide some explanation that makes sense of all this. After hanging up, I realized I needed to prepare for what was coming. Once the story was published, my life in Millfield would change dramatically. Rachel and David would know I was the source, regardless of how Carol had initially approached the investigation. My grandchildren would learn devastating truths about their mother. The entire community would be talking about the scandal. I called my friends and asked them to come over Saturday evening. If this was going to be my last night of anonymity, I wanted to spend it with the people who truly cared about me. That evening, we ordered pizza and tried to have a normal evening, but tension hung in the air like fog. We all knew that by Sunday night, everything would be different. "Are you having second thoughts?" Helen asked as we sat in my living room. "About exposing Rachel?" "No," I said firmly. "She's been stealing from people who were trying to help children in need. That's unforgivable. But I am scared about what comes next." "What scares you most?" Susan asked. I thought about it carefully. I'm scared that David will never forgive me. I'm scared that Tyler and Emma will hate me for destroying their family. I'm scared that I'll be seen as the vindictive old woman who couldn't let a family feud go. "And what if some of those things happen?" Margaret asked gently. "Then I'll deal with it," I said, surprising myself with how certain I sounded. Because the alternative was letting Rachel continue to victimize people while systematically destroying any chance I had of a relationship with my grandchildren. At least this way, the truth will be out there. We talked late into the night, and when my friends finally left, I felt as ready as I could be for whatever Sunday would bring. I'd made my choice, and now I had to live with the consequences. Sunday morning dawned gray and drizzly, fitting weather for what I expected to be a difficult day. I walked to the corner store to buy a copy of the Millfield Gazette, my hands shaking slightly as I approached the newspaper rack. There it was, front page, with a headline that made my heart race. "Local woman accused of charity fraud. Investigation reveals fake organizations and missing donations." Below the headline was a large photo of Rachel at one of her supposed charity events, holding a check made out to one of the fictional organizations. I bought a copy and hurried home, my pulse pounding as I read Carol's carefully researched article. She'd done an excellent job, presenting the facts objectively while letting the evidence speak for itself. Rachel's response, quoted near the end of the article, was exactly what I'd expected. Claims of misunderstanding, accusations that disgruntled family members were spreading lies, and promises to provide documentation that never materialized. By noon, my phone was ringing constantly. The first call was from David, his voice shaking with rage. "How could you do this to us?" he demanded, without even saying hello. "How could you destroy your own family?" "I didn't destroy anything, David," I replied calmly. I just stopped pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. "Rachel is devastated. The kids are humiliated. Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I've told the truth about a woman who's been stealing from charitable donors and lying to everyone around her, including you." "Those are lies," he shouted. Rachel explained everything. The reporter misunderstood, took things out of context. "David," I said firmly, I have copies of all the evidence. The fake charities, the stolen donations, the gifts she returned and sold for profit. This isn't a misunderstanding. There was a long silence, and when he spoke again, his voice was different, uncertain. You gave the reporter that information? Yes, I did. Another silence, longer this time. Why? Why would you hurt us like this? Because I was tired of being hurt, I said quietly. Because I was tired of watching Rachel steal from good people while presenting herself as a saint. Because Tyler and Emma deserve to know that their grandmother has been trying to love and support them, even if their mother has been intercepting that love for her own gain. You've ruined everything, he said, and I could hear tears in his voice. No, David, Rachel ruined everything. I just stopped enabling her to do it. He hung up without saying goodbye, and I sat in my quiet apartment, feeling strangely peaceful despite everything that was happening. I'd finally told the truth, finally stood up for myself, finally refused to be the victim in someone else's story. The phone kept ringing throughout the day. Some calls were from neighbors and acquaintances, wanting to know if the story was true. Others were from people I didn't know. Journalists from other papers wanting to follow up on the story. I answered the ones that seemed legitimate and ignored the rest. By evening, I was emotionally exhausted but oddly satisfied. I'd spent years being dismissed, ignored, and treated like an inconvenience by my own family. Today, for the first time in a long time, I felt like I'd taken control of my own narrative. The real test would come in the days ahead, when the full consequences of my actions became clear. But for now, I was content, knowing that I'd finally stood up for myself and for the truth, regardless of the cost. Monday morning brought chaos that I hadn't fully anticipated. I woke up to find 3 news vans parked outside Maple Gardens, their satellite dishes reaching toward the gray sky like mechanical flowers seeking sunlight. Through my bedroom window, I could see reporters setting up equipment and checking their hair in compact mirrors. Word had spread beyond Millfield, and what started as a local story was becoming regional news. My phone had been ringing since 5 in the morning. I'd turned the ringer off after the 4th call, but I could see the screen lighting up constantly with incoming calls from numbers I didn't recognize. The story had apparently struck a nerve with people far beyond our small town. I made my coffee and toast in the relative quiet of my kitchen, trying to prepare myself mentally for whatever this day would bring. I'd known there would be consequences to exposing Rachel's fraud, but I hadn't anticipated this level of media attention. The story was clearly resonating with people who'd had their own experiences with charity scams or family manipulation. Around 8 o'clock, Helen knocked on my door. I peeked through the curtains first, making sure it wasn't a reporter, before letting her in. "How are you holding up?" she asked, embracing me warmly. I saw the news trucks when I was walking over. "I'm okay," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure that was true. A bit overwhelmed by all the attention, but okay. Helen followed me into the kitchen, where I poured her a cup of coffee. Margaret and Susan wanted to come over too, but we figured it might be better to take turns so you're not completely surrounded. I appreciated their thoughtfulness. My friends had been my anchor through all of this, and I knew I'd need their support more than ever in the coming days. "Any word from David or the kids?" Helen asked gently. I shook my head. David called yesterday and was furious, but nothing since then. I imagine they're dealing with their own media circus. "Speaking of which," Helen said, pulling out her phone, "have you seen the follow-up coverage?" I hadn't. After reading the original article yesterday, I deliberately avoided looking at news websites or social media. I wasn't sure I was ready to see what people were saying about the situation. Helen showed me her phone screen, where a news website was displaying an article titled, "Charity Fraud Case Highlights Growing Problem of Fake Fundraising." The piece used Rachel's story as a jumping-off point to discuss the broader issue of fraudulent charitable organizations and how to protect yourself from scams. "It's not just about Rachel anymore," Helen explained. "The story has become part of a larger conversation about charity fraud. People are sharing their own experiences with fake fundraisers in the comments." I scrolled through some of the comments, my heart racing as I read them. Many people were sharing stories of being deceived by fraudulent charities, often involving children or veterans. Several comments specifically praised me for having the courage to speak up, calling me a hero for exposing the truth. "I don't feel like a hero," I said quietly. "I feel like someone who finally got fed up enough to stop being a doormat." "Sometimes that's the same thing," Helen replied. My phone buzzed with yet another incoming call. This time the caller ID showed a number from the state police. I looked at Helen with wide eyes before answering. "Mrs. Thompson?" "This is Detective Sarah Martinez with the State Police Fraud Unit. I'm calling about the article in yesterday's Millfield Gazette regarding Rachel Morrison. Would you be available to speak with us about the allegations?" My mouth went dry. I'd known that exposing Rachel's fraud might lead to criminal charges, but hearing from the police made it suddenly very real. "Yes, I can speak with you," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "When would be convenient?" "Would this afternoon work? We could meet at the Millfield police station, if that's easier for you than driving to our office." We arranged to meet at 2 o'clock, and after hanging up, I sat in my kitchen feeling a mixture of satisfaction and terror. Rachel was about to face real consequences for her actions, but that also meant my family was about to be thrust into a criminal investigation. "The police want to interview me this afternoon," I told Helen. "That's good," she said firmly. "Rachel needs to be held accountable for what she's done." Around 10 o'clock, Margaret arrived to relieve Helen. She brought pastries from the bakery downtown and news from her morning errands. "People are talking about this everywhere," she reported as she set up the pastries on my kitchen counter. "I stopped at 3 different stores this morning, and every single place had someone discussing the article. The general consensus seems to be that you did the right thing." "What about David and Rachel? Are people taking sides?" Margaret's expression grew more serious. "It's complicated. Some people are defending Rachel, saying she's being unfairly attacked by a bitter mother-in-law. But most people seem shocked by the evidence, especially the ones who donated to her holiday hope drive." That reminded me of something I'd been wondering about. Have any of the donors contacted the police yet? According to what I heard at the grocery store, at least 5 families have called the police to report that they gave money to the holiday hope drive and want to know how to get it back. The scope of Rachel's victims was becoming clearer. This wasn't just about my hurt feelings or family drama anymore. Real people had lost real money because they trusted Rachel's lies about helping children in need. Around noon, Susan arrived with lunch from Rosewood Diner. As we ate, she filled me in on the latest developments she'd heard through her network of friends and neighbors. "David hasn't been to work since the story broke," she reported. "His boss called this morning, asking if I knew whether he was sick or dealing with a family emergency. Morrison Manufacturing was Millfield's largest employer, and David had worked there for over 15 years. If he lost his job on top of everything else, their financial situation would go from bad to catastrophic." "There's something else," Susan continued hesitantly. "I heard that Tyler came home yesterday afternoon and had a huge fight with Rachel. Apparently he'd read the article and was furious about the baseball card. My heart clenched thinking about my grandson learning that his Christmas gift had been stolen and sold by his own mother." "How do you know about the fight?" "Their neighbor Mrs. Patterson heard shouting and called to check if everything was okay. According to her, Tyler was yelling about how his grandmother had actually given him something valuable and meaningful, and Rachel had stolen it from him. So Tyler finally knew the truth about at least one of my gifts." I wondered how he was processing everything, whether he was reassessing other interactions with me over the years, wondering what else his mother had hidden from him. "What about Emma?" I asked. No word about Emma specifically, but Mrs. Patterson said she saw a lot of cars coming and going from their house yesterday evening. Family members, it looked like. I imagined Rachel's family rallying around her, either to provide support or to demand answers. Either way, it meant the scandal was spreading beyond just David's immediate family. At 1:30, I left for my meeting with Detective Martinez. Margaret offered to drive me, but I declined. I needed to face this part alone. to take full responsibility for the choice I'd made to expose Rachel's fraud. The Millfield police station was a small brick building that I'd driven past thousands of times but never entered. Detective Martinez turned out to be a woman in her 40s, with short brown hair and a professional but kind demeanor. She led me to a small conference room where another officer was waiting. "Mrs. Thompson, thank you for coming in. I'm Detective Martinez, and this is Officer Johnson. We're investigating the allegations made in yesterday's newspaper article, and we'd like to get your account of what happened." For the next 2 hours, I told them everything. They recorded our conversation and took detailed notes as I described Rachel's fake charities, the Holiday Hope Drive, the returned gifts, and my discovery of Tyler's baseball card being sold online. I provided them with copies of all the evidence Margaret had helped me gather. "How long do you think Rachel has been running these fraudulent fundraisers?" Detective Martinez asked. "Based on what I've seen, at least 2 years," I replied. "But it could be longer. My friends and I only researched the most recent activities." Officer Johnson looked up from his notes. "Do you have any idea how much money she might have stolen in total?" I shook my head. "The Holiday Hope Drive alone was $3,000, but there were other fundraisers mentioned on her social media that we didn't investigate thoroughly." Detective Martinez closed her notebook and leaned back in her chair. "Mrs. Thompson, I want you to know that you did the right thing coming forward with this information. Charity fraud is a serious crime that often goes unreported because people are embarrassed about being taken advantage of." "What happens next?" I asked. "We'll be conducting a full investigation, which will include interviewing Mrs. Morrison, examining her financial records, and speaking with anyone who donated money to her various fundraisers. Depending on what we find, she could face charges ranging from misdemeanor fraud to felony theft." The drive home felt surreal. In the span of a few days, I'd gone from being a dismissed grandmother to being a key witness in a criminal investigation. The reporters were still camped outside Maple Gardens when I returned, and I had to navigate carefully to avoid them. Back in my apartment, I found a stack of messages on my answering machine. Most were from reporters or producers wanting interviews, but 3 stood out from the rest. The first was from Emma, her young voice shaky and uncertain. "Grandma Andrea, it's Emma. I read the newspaper article. I need to talk to you about some things. Could you call me back?" The second was from Tyler, his voice tight with emotion. "Grandma, this is Tyler. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry about everything. I had no idea what Mom was doing with your gifts. Please call me." The third message made my hands tremble as I listened to it. It was from a woman I didn't recognize. "Mrs. Thompson, my name is Jennifer Walsh. My family donated $500 to your daughter-in-law's Holiday Hope Drive because we thought we were helping local children have a better Christmas. I want you to know that what you did took tremendous courage, and I hope she faces consequences for stealing from families like mine." I sat down heavily in my kitchen chair, overwhelmed by the range of emotions these messages triggered. My grandchildren wanted to talk to me, really talk to me, possibly for the first time in years. But their desire for communication was born out of pain and betrayal, not genuine affection. The message from Jennifer Walsh hit me even harder. This was exactly why I'd felt compelled to expose Rachel's fraud. Real families had made real sacrifices to help children they thought were in need, only to have their generosity stolen to fund Rachel's shopping habits. Around 5 o'clock, Helen returned to check on me. I played her the messages, and she listened with a mixture of sadness and satisfaction. "Are you going to call Emma and Tyler back?" she asked. "I don't know," I admitted. "Part of me wants to, desperately. But another part of me worries that they're only reaching out because their world has been turned upside down, not because they actually want a relationship with me." "Does it matter?" Helen asked gently. "If talking to them helps them process what they've learned about their mother, isn't that worthwhile regardless of their motives?" She had a point. Even if my grandchildren were only calling because they needed answers, at least they were calling. For years, I'd wanted nothing more than meaningful communication with Tyler and Emma. The circumstances weren't what I would have chosen, but the opportunity was finally there. "I think I need to call them," I said finally. "Do you want me to stay, or would you prefer privacy?" "Could you stay?" I'm not sure how these conversations are going to go, and I might need moral support. I decided to call Emma first, partly because her message had sounded the most vulnerable. She answered on the first ring, as if she'd been waiting by the phone. Grandma? Thank you for calling me back. Of course, sweetheart. How are you holding up? There was a long pause, and when she spoke again, I could hear tears in her voice. I'm confused and angry and sad all at the same time. I read the article about Mom, and then Tyler told me about his baseball card, and I don't understand how she could do those things. It's a lot to process, I said gently. I'm sure this is very difficult for you. Grandma, can I ask you something? Emma's voice was small and hesitant. Anything, honey. The article mentioned that Mom returned Christmas gifts and called them cheap. Were those gifts for me and Tyler? My heart broke at the vulnerability in her question. Yes, they were. What did you get me? I described the professional-grade art supplies, the leather journal, the thought that had gone into choosing materials that would support her obvious talent. As I spoke, I could hear Emma crying quietly on the other end of the line. I never got any of that, she whispered. I had no idea you even knew I was interested in art. I've always known, Emma. I've been trying to support your talent for years, but apparently my gifts never reached you. Mom always told us that you didn't really understand us, that you were out of touch with what kids our age were interested in. She made it sound like you just grabbed random things at the store without thinking about what we actually liked. The systematic nature of Rachel's manipulation was becoming clear. She hadn't just been stealing my gifts. She'd been poisoning my grandchildren against me, making them believe I was the uncaring grandmother who gave thoughtless presents. Emma, I want you to know that I have paid attention to your interests all these years. I know about your art competitions, your talent, your dreams. I have been trying to show my support, but those attempts were apparently intercepted. We talked for another 20 minutes, with Emma asking questions about other gifts I'd given over the years, slowly piecing together the scope of what her mother had hidden from her. By the end of our conversation, she was angry rather than sad. I can't believe she did this to us, Emma said fiercely. She kept us from having a relationship with you, and for what? Money? I don't know what her motivations were, I said honestly. But I want you to know that none of this changes how much I love you and Tyler. After hanging up with Emma, I called Tyler. His conversation was shorter, but equally emotional. He was particularly upset about the baseball card, not just because of its value, but because it showed that I'd been paying attention to his interests. I thought you didn't care about the things I liked, he admitted. Mom always made it seem like you were just going through the motions of being a grandmother. I've never been going through the motions with you or Emma, I assured him. You're both very important to me. By the time I finished talking to my grandchildren, I was emotionally drained but oddly hopeful. For the first time in years, Tyler and Emma were seeing me as a real person rather than an obligation. The circumstances were terrible, but the communication was real. Helen had listened to both conversations from across the room, and when I hung up, she came over and hugged me tightly. How do you feel? She asked. Sad for them, I said. They're learning that their mother has been lying to them their entire lives. That has to be devastating. But also hopeful, Helen prompted. Yes, I admitted. Also hopeful. For the first time, they understand that their grandmother has been trying to love them all along. That evening brought more phone calls, more messages, and more media attention. But for the first time since this whole ordeal began, I felt like I'd made the right choice. Rachel's house of lies was crumbling, and while that was painful for everyone involved, it was also creating space for truth and genuine relationships. The consequences of my decision to expose Rachel's fraud were far from over. In fact, they were just beginning. But sitting in my quiet apartment that evening, listening to the messages from my grandchildren, and thinking about the conversation with Detective Martinez, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: the satisfaction of standing up for what was right, regardless of the personal cost. Rachel had built her life on deception and manipulation, hurting countless people in the process. Now she would face the consequences of those choices, And perhaps, in the wreckage of her lies, something honest and genuine could finally grow. 6 months later, I stood in Emma's high school auditorium, watching my granddaughter accept a scholarship award for artistic excellence. Her painting, a vibrant piece about family healing, hung behind the podium as she spoke about overcoming adversity and finding authentic relationships. Tyler sat beside me, no longer the distant young man I'd known for years, but someone who genuinely wanted me in his life. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Rachel was serving 18 months in minimum security prison after pleading guilty to multiple counts of charity fraud. The investigation had uncovered over $15,000 in stolen donations across various fake fundraising campaigns. She'd also been ordered to pay full restitution to her victims, though most people doubted they'd ever see their money again. David had moved out of the family home 3 weeks after my interview with the police. The foreclosure had gone through, but by then he was already living in a small apartment across town, working 2 part-time jobs to pay child support and legal fees. Our relationship remained strained, but he'd stopped blaming me entirely for the family's collapse. Time and therapy had helped him understand that Rachel's deception ran far deeper than anyone had realized. The most surprising development had been Tyler's complete turnaround. After learning the truth about his baseball card and other gifts, he'd reached out to me weekly, often stopping by my apartment after his shifts at the electronics store, where he now worked full-time. He'd also enrolled in community college classes, determined to eventually transfer to a 4-year university and study business management. Emma had moved in with David temporarily, but she spent most weekends with me. We developed a tradition of cooking dinner together on Sundays, during which she'd tell me about her art projects and college plans. The professional supplies I'd originally bought her had been recovered from Rachel's belongings and finally given to their intended recipient. Emma treasured them not just for their quality, but for what they represented about our relationship. The most profound change had been in myself. I no longer felt like someone constantly seeking approval or acceptance from people who had no intention of giving it. Helen, Margaret, and Susan remained my closest companions, but I'd also developed new friendships through a support group for grandparents dealing with family estrangement. Turns out, my story wasn't as unique as I'd thought. I'd also started volunteering at the Millfield Community Center, helping elderly residents navigate social services and family conflicts. My experience with manipulation and boundary setting had given me insights that helped other people recognize and address similar situations in their own lives. The media attention had eventually died down, though I still occasionally received letters from people who'd read about the case online. Most were supportive, sharing their own stories of family manipulation or charity fraud. A few were critical, accusing me of destroying my family for revenge. I'd learned to accept both responses with equanimity. What surprised me most was how little I missed the version of family I'd lost. The constant tension, the walking on eggshells, the feeling of being barely tolerated, none of it had actually been worth preserving. The relationships I had now with Tyler and Emma were honest, reciprocal, and genuinely affectionate. Quality had replaced quantity in ways I'd never expected to appreciate. Rachel's sentencing hearing had been particularly difficult. She'd maintained her innocence until the very end, claiming that family members had conspired against her and that the evidence had been misinterpreted. But when the judge read victim impact statements from families who donated to her fake charities, her facade finally cracked. She'd sobbed as she heard about the sacrifices people had made to help children they thought were in need. I hadn't felt satisfaction watching her break down. Instead, I'd felt sad for the person she might have been if she'd chosen honesty over manipulation, genuine service over performative charity. But I didn't regret exposing her crimes. Too many innocent people had been hurt by her deception. Emma finished her acceptance speech and stepped down from the podium to enthusiastic applause. As she walked toward us, beaming with pride and clutching her scholarship certificate, I felt a joy I'd almost forgotten was possible. This was what family was supposed to feel like: mutual celebration, genuine support, uncomplicated love. Tyler stood up to hug his sister as she reached our row. "I'm so proud of you," he whispered, and I saw Emma's eyes fill with happy tears. "Grandma Andrea," she said, turning to me, "thank you for believing in my art even when I didn't know you were doing it." "Thank you for letting me back into your life," I replied, meaning every word. As we left the auditorium together, Tyler walking beside me and Emma linking her arm through mine, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed. A year ago, I'd been a lonely woman whose family treated her as an inconvenience. Now I was someone with genuine relationships, meaningful friendships, and a sense of purpose that extended beyond seeking approval from people who didn't value me. The cost had been high. David and I might never fully repair our relationship, and Rachel's children would always carry the scars of learning their mother was a criminal. But the alternative had been watching Tyler and Emma grow up believing their grandmother didn't care about them, while Rachel continued victimizing innocent people with her fraudulent schemes. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's destructive behavior, even when that someone is family. Rachel had counted on my silence, my desire to keep peace, my willingness to absorb abuse rather than create conflict. When I finally stopped cooperating with my own mistreatment, her entire system of manipulation collapsed. The newspaper had done a follow-up story 6 months after the original article, focusing on the recovery of the families who'd been defrauded and the importance of researching charitable organizations before donating. I declined to be interviewed for that piece, feeling that the focus should be on Rachel's victims rather than on me. But privately, I'd been proud of the role I'd played in bringing justice to people who'd been taken advantage of. Jennifer Walsh, the woman who'd called to thank me, had become something of an advocate for charity fraud awareness. She'd started a local organization that helped people verify the legitimacy of fundraising campaigns, ensuring that other families wouldn't fall victim to schemes like Rachel's. As we drove home from Emma's ceremony, Tyler in the front seat and Emma in the back showing me photos she'd taken of her winning artwork, I realized that everything I truly wanted from family was finally mine. Not the perfect grandmother role I'd imagined, where everyone gathered for harmonious holiday dinners, but something better. Authentic relationships with people who actually wanted me in their lives. Helen had been right all those months ago when she'd asked what I was fighting for. I'd been fighting for a fantasy, trying to preserve relationships that existed only in my imagination. What I had now was real, built on truth and mutual respect rather than obligation and guilt. The woman who'd sat in her apartment 6 months ago, staring at a box of returned gifts and wondering where everything had gone wrong, felt like a stranger to me now. That woman had been so focused on being accepted that she'd forgotten to demand respect. She'd been so afraid of losing family that she'd allowed herself to become invisible within it. But sometimes you have to be willing to lose everything false in order to gain something true. And what I'd gained was worth far more than what I'd lost. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.